You are lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, convinced that if you just packed your bags, quit your exhausting job, and moved across the country, the heavy, suffocating weight sitting on your chest would finally disappear. You imagine a quiet cabin in the woods, a minimalist apartment in a brand new city, or a remote coastal town where nobody expects anything from you. You expect that changing your zip code will magically change your brain chemistry. But reality holds a much darker, far more uncomfortable truth. Wherever you go, you drag the exact same mind with you. Today we are tearing down the illusion of the perfect escape by examining a survival manual written by a 12th century Japanese hermit who literally watched his society burn to the ground. You will discover why running away from your problems never works, and what you must do instead to find actual peace, right where you are standing. Chapter 1. The Illusion of the Perfect Escape. It happens late at night, usually when the exhaustion of your daily routine has entirely drained the color from your life. Your thumb mindlessly scrolls through real estate applications, travel blogs, or videos of people living completely off the grid. You begin to believe that the primary source of your deep internal unrest is your physical location. You convince yourself that the walls of your current apartment, the streets of your current city, and the people currently surrounding you are actively conspiring to keep you miserable. The logical conclusion your brain jumps to is both simple and incredibly dangerous. You just need to leave. You need a blank slate. You believe that stepping off an airplane or driving your car across state lines will instantly shed your old anxieties, leaving you as a refreshed, untroubled, and entirely new version of yourself. Psychologists have a specific term for this deeply ingrained human fantasy. They call it the geographic cure. It is the persistent, seductive belief that relocating to a new environment will automatically resolve our internal psychological suffering. In the fields of addiction recovery and behavioral psychology, the geographic cure is widely recognized as one of the most common and devastating traps a person can fall into. We look at our messy, complicated lives and decide that instead of untangling the psychological knots inside our own heads, we will simply abandon the tangled mess and buy a new ball of string somewhere else. In the United States alone, approximately 12% of the population packs up and moves every single year. While many of these moves are for legitimate career or family reasons, a massive underlying current of this migration is driven by the desperate pursuit of happiness. We are a species constantly on the run, chasing the horizon, certain that peace of mind is waiting for us in the next town over. Yet, the raw data paints a strikingly different picture of what happens when we actually try to outrun our problems. A comprehensive study published in the Journal of Environmental Psychology examined individuals who moved long distances, and the researchers found something that completely shatters the romanticized view of starting over. Instead of experiencing a profound psychological reset, individuals frequently experienced a sharp decline in their overall well-being during the adjustment period. The physical act of moving strips away established social support systems and familiar routines, leaving the individual entirely isolated, with nothing but their own unfiltered thoughts. You might change the scenery outside your window, but the internal narrator criticizing your every move remains exactly the same. The panic attacks, the creeping sense of inadequacy, and the profound feeling of emptiness do not care about your new address. They pack themselves neatly into your carry-on luggage and unpack themselves the moment you unlock the door to your new, supposedly perfect life. To truly understand why our obsession with controlling and perfecting our environment is a guaranteed recipe for misery, we have to look backward. Over 800 years ago, a man learned this exact lesson through the most brutal, terrifying circumstances imaginable. His name was Kamo no Chōmei, and he lived in 12th century Japan. Chōmei was not born a rugged survivalist or an ascetic monk. He was a man of high culture, born into a prestigious family of Shinto priests in the capital city of Kyoto. In his youth, he worked as a court poet, an accomplished musician playing the biwa, and a man deeply embedded in the intricate status-obsessed social hierarchy of his time. Like many of us today, he believed in the promise of stability. He believed that if you secured the right job, built a strong, beautiful home, and surrounded yourself with the right people, you could construct a fortress that would protect you from the unpredictability of the world. He expected to inherit his father's prestigious position and live out his days in comfort and high societal standing. But the universe has a violently indifferent way of responding to human plans. Between the years 1177 and 1185, Chōmei watched his supposedly impenetrable world literally tear itself apart. In the spring of 1177, a fire broke out in the capital. This was not a minor localized blaze. Fueled by fierce winds, the fire transformed into a ravenous, unstoppable beast that swept through Kyoto, turning the sky the color of bruised plums and filling the air with the thick, choking scent of burning cedar and melting ambitions. The grand, sprawling wooden estates of the wealthy aristocrats, estates that took decades to build and fortunes to maintain, were reduced to grey ash in a matter of hours. People who had tied their entire identities, their self-worth and their sense of security to their massive homes, found themselves standing in the smouldering ruins with absolutely nothing. The immense physical structures they believed would keep them safe were obliterated, exposing the terrifying fragility of their existence. The devastation, however, was only just beginning. Only a few years later, in 1180, a massive whirlwind tore through the city. Chōmei documented how the violent funnel completely flattened entire city blocks, snapping sturdy homes like brittle twigs and scattering the debris for miles. If the fire had proved that wealth could be burned away, the whirlwind proved that physical location offered zero shelter from random chaos. Following the destruction of the city's infrastructure, the agricultural systems collapsed, leading to a horrifying famine. The sensory reality of Kyoto shifted from the smell of burning wood to the inescapable stench of death. Chōmei walked the streets and witnessed things that permanently altered his psychology. He saw corpses piled against the walls of once great mansions. He described the heart-wrenching sight of starving infants attempting to suckle at the breasts of their deceased mothers. The wealth, the status, and the societal coordinates that the people of Kyoto had obsessed over meant absolutely nothing when the fundamental necessities of life vanished. Then, as if to deliver a final, crushing blow to the illusion of human control, the earth itself betrayed them. In 1185, a catastrophic earthquake struck. Chōmei described it as the most terrifying event of his lifetime, noting how the very mountains seemed to crumble and fall. The ground beneath their feet, the one thing humans universally rely upon to remain stable, split open. For Chōmei, witnessing the earthquake was the ultimate psychological breaking point. You can build fireproof walls, you can store food against famine, but when the very ground you stand on turns to liquid and swallows your life's work, you are forced to confront a terrifying reality. There is no physical escape from disaster. There is no geographic location, no architectural design, and no amount of accumulated wealth that can permanently insulate you from the chaotic forces of the universe. In the aftermath of these relentless tragedies, Chōmei sat in the ruins of his former life and wrote a profound meditation on the human condition that would become a cornerstone of Japanese literature. Written in 1212, his work is titled The Hōjōki, which translates to An Account of My Hut. Through his traumatic experiences, Chōmei pinpointed the exact source of human suffering. The agony of the people in Kyoto was not just caused by the fire, the wind, or the earthquake. The deepest layer of their suffering was caused by their absolute refusal to accept the fundamental law of the universe, the law of impermanence, known in Buddhist philosophy as Mujo. We suffer intensely because we live in a world that is constantly moving, shifting, and destroying, yet we exhaust all of our mental and physical energy trying to freeze it in place. We try to nail down our relationships, our careers, and our living situations, demanding that they remain permanently unchanged. When the inevitable winds of time and chance blow our rigid structures down, we are left completely devastated, crying over the broken pieces of a life we never truly had control over in the first place. Chōmei perfectly encapsulated this tension in the famous opening lines of the Hōjōki. He wrote, "The flow of the river is ceaseless, and its water is never the same. The bubbles that float in the pools, now vanishing, now forming, are not of long duration. So in the world are man and his dwellings." Read those words again, and visualize the physical reality of a river. When you stand on the bank of a fast-moving stream and stare at a swirling eddy of water, it looks like a solid, continuous object. You can point to it, name it, and expect it to be there tomorrow. But if you try to reach out and grab it, the water slips right through your fingers. The eddy is just a temporary pattern created by an endless, ever-changing flow of new water. Your life, your current problems, your bank account, and your physical location are exactly like that river. They are temporary patterns of energy and circumstance. The tension in your chest right now, the anxiety that is making you grind your teeth and desperately search for a new city to move to, comes from the fact that you are standing in the middle of a rushing river, trying to hold the water still with your bare hands. You are fighting a war against the basic physics of reality. You believe that if you can just find the perfect apartment, the perfect partner, and the perfect job, you can finally build a dam strong enough to stop the river from flowing. But every dam eventually breaks. The more rigid and inflexible you make your life in an attempt to feel safe, the more catastrophic the damage will be when the earthquake inevitably comes. This brings us to the single, most critical takeaway of this module. Your actionable step today is to radically shift your relationship with control. You must stop trying to micromanage your external environment as a substitute for internal emotional regulation. Acknowledge the flowing river. When you feel the desperate, overwhelming urge to run away, to quit, or to blindly uproot your life, because the present moment feels uncomfortable, you must train yourself to sit still in the discomfort. Notice the physical sensation of wanting to escape, the tight chest, the racing thoughts, and recognize it not as a signal to move your physical body, but as a signal to loosen your mental grip. You do not need a new zip code, you need a new perspective on impermanence. By accepting that your environment will always be flawed, shifting, and outside of your absolute control, you instantly rob it of its power to make you miserable. You stop wasting your energy fighting the current and finally learn how to float. But as Chōmei discovered, simply knowing that the world is impermanent is not enough to secure true peace of mind. Determined to completely detach from the chaotic, burning world of Kyoto, he made a radical decision. He abandoned his wealth, his status, and his social circle, and walked deep into the remote mountains to build the ultimate, isolated, minimalist life in a tiny 10-foot square hut. He thought that by entirely removing himself from society, he would finally find the perfect, unbreakable serenity he had been searching for. Yet, deep in the silent woods, completely alone in his tiny shelter, he stumbled into a deeply hidden psychological trap that almost entirely destroyed his newfound enlightenment. So what happens when you cut off the outside world entirely and try to live in absolute isolation? The answer is a terrifying paradox that minimalists and modern escapists rarely want to admit. Chapter 2. The Geography of Anxiety. You imagine the day you finally get the keys to the upgraded house in the nicer neighborhood. You picture yourself standing on the pristine hardwood floor, sunlight streaming through the tall windows, taking a deep, restorative breath. You expect that crossing the threshold into a more expensive zip code will wash away your lifelong insecurities. You expect a quiet, unshakable confidence to settle into your chest, a physical relaxation of the muscles in your neck and back. But reality operates on a cruel irony. The day you move into that better neighborhood, your stomach ties itself into a tight, vibrating knot. Your eyes dart to the driveway next door. You see a custom-built luxury car that costs more than your entire annual salary. You see a neighbor carrying designer bags with an effortless posture. Instead of the deep exhale you expected, your jaw clenches. Your heart rate accelerates. The heavy weight of inadequacy returns, and it feels heavier than before. You believed that changing your geography would bring you peace, but instead it just upgraded your anxiety. We possess a fundamental flaw in human logic. We treat our physical coordinates, our job titles, and the perceived status of the people living next door to us like a scoreboard for our self-worth. We walk through life with a persistent ache in our chests, a sense of falling behind, and we attempt to cure that ache by rearranging the external furniture of our lives. When you feel small, you try to buy a bigger house. When you feel unimportant, you hustle for a corner office in a more prestigious city. You convince yourself that if you can just secure a spot in the right neighborhood, among the right people, the lingering drumbeat of stress in your ears will finally go quiet. However, your environment does not cure your ego. It weaponizes it. Over 800 years ago, in the smoldering ruins of 12th century Japan, Kamo no Chōmei documented this exact psychological phenomenon. Before he abandoned society to become a hermit, Chōmei lived in the capital city of Kyoto, a place obsessed with rigid social hierarchies and the relentless display of wealth. He paid close attention to how people behaved based on where their houses were located and who lived next to them. His observations cut through centuries of time and describe our modern behavior with startling accuracy. In his survival manual, the Hōjōki, Chōmei wrote down a universal truth. Wealth brings great anxiety, while with poverty come fierce resentments. He noted that living in close proximity to wealthy people forces a person into a state of constant, humiliating comparison. When you live next to someone who possesses significantly more status than you do, your posture physically changes. Chōmei observed that people living near the wealthy become obsequious. They bow a little lower. They force polite smiles while their stomachs churn with a toxic mixture of shame and envy. They cannot even enjoy the simple comforts of their own homes because they are hyper-aware of the massive looming estate next door, casting a literal and metaphorical shadow over their lives. Conversely, Chōmei noticed that living next to people who have less than you provides no peace either. If you build a nice house in a struggling neighborhood, your nervous system remains on high alert. You become paranoid, you install locks, you build fences, and you lie awake at night listening to the sound of breaking branches, convinced someone is coming to steal your possessions. You look at your struggling neighbors and feel a complicated, uncomfortable mix of guilt, fear, and defensive superiority. The environment becomes a cage. Whether you look up at the rich or look down at the poor, your mind remains trapped in a state of reactive stress. Your happiness is held hostage by the coordinates of your home and the financial status of the people sharing your street. Today, this dynamic has mutated into a psychological crisis of unprecedented proportions. In Chōmei's time, your neighborhood consisted of a few dozen physical houses. If you wanted to compare yourself to a wealthy aristocrat, you had to physically walk past their estate. Today, your neighborhood is completely boundless. Through the device glowing in your pocket, you live right next door to billionaires, fitness models, child prodigies, and people broadcasting their highlight reels 24 hours a day. The digital world has scaled the geography of anxiety to a global level, removing any physical boundaries that once protected human sanity. When you open a social media application, your brain does not know the difference between a digital image and a physical neighbor. The physical reaction is identical. Your pupils dilate, your breath catches, and a spike of cortisol floods your bloodstream. You see a former classmate posting pictures from a luxury resort, and a cold, hollow sensation spreads through your ribs. You see a colleague celebrating a massive promotion, and your throat tightens. Society forces you into a perpetual state of hyper-arousal, where every waking moment is an opportunity to measure your own value against someone else's curated success. The scientific data regarding this constant environmental comparison reveals a terrifying reality about how it physically alters our health. Researchers investigating the psychological impacts of local income inequality have uncovered a direct link between the disparity of wealth in a specific area and the mental deterioration of the people living there. A prominent study analyzing the emotional responses of over 7,000 individuals in the United States demonstrated that living in areas with high income inequality acts as an accelerant for status anxiety. The researchers found that residents in unequal areas engage in much more frequent upward and downward economic comparisons. This environment breeds a ruthless sense of perceived competitiveness. The human brain registers the presence of extreme wealth nearby not as inspiration, but as a direct threat to its own survival and social standing. The mere existence of inequality in your physical environment tricks your nervous system into believing you are failing. This comparison trap intensifies when we look at our digital neighborhoods. We are not just casually observing others, we are internalizing a mathematical score of our own social worth. Recent research conducted at the University of Cambridge examined how adolescents interact with online platforms, and the findings exposed the raw mechanics of this suffering. The researchers pointed out a crucial, devastating feature of digital environments. They assign a concrete public number to friendships and social approval. For human beings, Social connection is a biological imperative, much like food or water. By turning relationships into a visible metric, the digital environment makes social comparison impossible to ignore. The Cambridge study found that for young people with internalizing conditions like anxiety and depression, the rate of engaging in toxic social comparison online was double that of their peers without such conditions. They reported feeling intense mood changes and deep inadequacy simply by existing in an environment that measures their worth in likes, shares, and follower counts. Furthermore, the United States Surgeon General has issued stark warnings about the severe consequences of this constant digital comparison. The advisory reports that existing in these hyper-curated environments perpetuates severe body dissatisfaction, fuels disordered eating behaviors, and crushes self-esteem. When you inhabit an environment, physical or digital, that constantly shows you idealized versions of human existence, your brain internalizes a message of chronic failure. You stop looking at your own life with gratitude and start looking at it with contempt. You stare at your living room, your wardrobe, or your own face in the mirror, and you feel a distinct, gnawing disgust, completely unaware that this disgust was artificially manufactured by the environment you chose to inhabit. You are playing a rigged game. The rules dictate that you must constantly scan your surroundings, evaluate the status of the people around you, and adjust your self-worth accordingly. As long as you play this game, you will never experience a single moment of genuine peace. If you achieve wealth and move to a luxury community, you will simply find richer neighbors to make you feel poor. If you accumulate followers, you will find someone with a larger audience to make you feel irrelevant. The treadmill never stops, and the incline only gets steeper. This leads to the single most critical action you must take to reclaim your sanity. You must ruthlessly decouple your self-worth from your physical and digital coordinates. You must establish a system of internal validation that acts as an impenetrable shield against spatial and societal validation. Think about the physical manifestation of this change. Right now, when you encounter someone with higher status, your body physically reacts by shrinking. Your shoulders roll forward, your gaze drops to the floor, and your breath becomes shallow. You surrender your internal power to an external circumstance. To practice decoupling, you must consciously intercept this physical reaction. The next time you find yourself scrolling through a feed of impossible lifestyles, or the next time you walk past a neighbor whose display of wealth triggers that familiar twist in your gut, stop moving. Plant your feet firmly on the ground. Pull your shoulders back and down. Take a slow, deliberate breath that expands your lower stomach, and consciously remind yourself of a profound truth. The objects outside your body possess zero intrinsic ability to alter the value of the consciousness inside your body. Your peace of mind must survive regardless of who is in the room with you. It must survive regardless of the car parked in your driveway, the number displayed on your digital profile, or the zip code printed on your mail. Internal validation means constructing a set of personal metrics that nobody can see, buy, or take away from you. Measure your success by your integrity, your capacity to remain calm under pressure, and your ability to show kindness when you are exhausted. These are metrics that do not fluctuate based on the local economy or the algorithm of a social media platform. When you anchor your identity to these internal pillars, the towering estates of your neighbors and the curated highlights of the digital world lose their psychological grip on your throat. You look at them, acknowledge their existence, and walk past them without your heart rate changing a single beat. Kamo no Chōmei understood the toxic nature of this environmental comparison better than anyone. He realized that as long as he remained in the capital city, his ego would be constantly battered by the wealth of the aristocrats and the suffering of the poor. He decided that the only way to win this vicious game of status and geography was to stop playing it altogether. He made a radical choice. He abandoned his comfortable life, turned his back on society, and walked deep into the silent, remote mountains. There, he built the ultimate minimalist sanctuary, a tiny, portable shelter designed to strip away every single source of external comparison. That seemed like the flawless cure to the crushing stress of the modern world. But deep in the woods, surrounded by absolute silence and simplicity, extreme minimalism hides a dark, devastating trap that modern escapists never want to talk about. Chapter 3. The Minimalist Trap. You are standing in the center of your bedroom, clutching a heavy plastic garbage bag, aggressively tossing away old sweaters, stacks of unread books, and souvenirs you have held onto for a decade. You expect that the moment you tie a tight knot on that bag and drag it out to the curb, a profound, immediate sense of spiritual lightness will wash over your body. You expect that by stripping your physical life down to the bare essentials, adopting a strict minimalist aesthetic, and clearing off your countertops until they shine with absolute emptiness, the chaotic, racing static inside your brain will finally go completely quiet. You believe that throwing away your possessions will automatically throw away your stress, but reality is waiting to spring a brutal, deeply hidden psychological trap. You walk back into your perfectly empty room. The walls are blank, the surfaces are clear, but your jaw remains tightly clenched. Your shoulders are still creeping up toward your ears. A heavy, familiar knot sits right at the base of your throat. The anxiety has not left your body at all. It has simply changed its camouflage. Today we are dismantling the modern illusion of the minimalist cure. By examining the exact moment a 12th century hermit realized his perfectly simple, isolated life was actively destroying his peace of mind, you will discover why replacing an obsession with having everything with an obsession for having nothing is the exact same mental prison, just with fewer furnishings. To understand why the urge to purge your belongings rarely leads to lasting happiness, we first need to examine the psychological mechanism that drives you to buy that box of garbage bags in the first place. The modern world is characterized by an overwhelming sense of invisible friction. Your inbox is flooded with demands you cannot meet. Your financial obligations loom over your head like a dark cloud. The global news cycle feeds your nervous system a constant, low-level stream of panic. When your brain processes this immense lack of control, it desperately searches for a solvable problem in your immediate physical environment. It scans the room and targets your physical possessions. Your brain tells you a very convincing lie. It tells you that the pile of mail on the table and the crowded hangers in your closet are the root causes of your internal suffocation. We take the massive, unmanageable chaos of our internal lives and externalize it onto our material belongings. We convince ourselves that if we can just dictate exactly how many plates sit in the cupboard, we will finally regain authority over our existence. This triggers the decluttering binge. You experience a rapid heart rate and a surge of frantic energy as you empty drawers onto the floor. The physical act of throwing an item into the trash creates a sharp, powerful spike of dopamine. It feels like progress. It feels like taking your life back. However, this high is entirely temporary. Modern psychology points out a stark reality about this behavior, highlighting a phenomenon that researchers now call toxic minimalism. People become so hyperfixated on maintaining a sparse environment that they develop intense guilt and a paralyzing sense of shame over keeping anything that holds sentimental value. The act of getting rid of things ceases to be a practical exercise and morphs into a rigid, unforgiving moral framework. People enter a state of analysis paralysis, spending hours agonizing over whether a single coffee mug fits their newly adopted identity. They fear bringing anything new into their homes, viewing every object as a potential threat to their fragile, carefully constructed peace. The anxiety does not disappear, it just attaches itself to a new target. Instead of stressing about acquiring things, you spend all your mental energy aggressively guarding empty space. Furthermore, the aesthetic pursuit of this emptiness carries its own hidden psychological toll. We look at heavily curated images of minimalist homes, rooms painted entirely in stark white, beige, and gray, devoid of any visual weight or personal history. We assume these spaces breed tranquility. However, comprehensive research into consumer psychology and color theory reveals the exact opposite effect. A study published in the Journal of Fashion Marketing and Management examined the emotional impact of strict monochromatic and highly simplified wardrobes and environments. The researchers found a direct, documented link between strict neutral palettes and lower emotional arousal. By painting everything gray and throwing away anything with visual friction, individuals frequently experienced a flattening of their baseline mood. The study demonstrated that people wearing colorful clothing, or living in vibrant, varied spaces reported significantly higher confidence, energy, and sociability. Conversely, those enforcing strict, minimalist, neutral palettes often reported that their daily lives felt dull, less inspiring, and emotionally flat. Think about the physical reality of living in one of these perfectly curated minimalist spaces. You strip away the friction of life, but you also strip away the visual triggers for joy, memory, and comfort. You build a sterile environment, a perfect white box, and you wonder why your body registers the space as a sensory deprivation chamber. Your nervous system is not relaxed. It is understimulated and highly vigilant. When a family member leaves a pair of shoes in the hallway, or a friend places a bright red jacket on your beige sofa, you feel a sharp physical spike of tension in your chest. The object ruins the aesthetic. Your peace of mind is shattered by a single piece of fabric. This is the ultimate proof that you have not achieved true inner peace. You have merely constructed an incredibly fragile glass house, where the slightest intrusion of normal human life threatens to break your entire psychological foundation. You replaced the consumerism of accumulating junk with the incredibly expensive, highly curated consumerism of appearing to own nothing. To see the ultimate historical manifestation of this exact trap, we must return to the smoldering ruins of 12th century Japan and examine the life of Kamo no Chōmei. After witnessing the fire, the whirlwind, the famine, and the devastating earthquake that leveled the capital city of Kyoto, Chōmei reached a radical conclusion. He recognized that the aristocrats in the city were miserable because they tied their identities to massive, immovable estates and rigid societal status. When the earth shook, their identities crumbled with their walls. Chōmei decided he would not play this losing game. He decided that the only path to true, unbreakable happiness was to walk away from society altogether and completely eliminate his dependence on the material world. He decided to become the ultimate minimalist. In his late 50s, Chōmei renounced his ties to the world and moved deep into the remote, silent forests of Mount Hino. He determined that a permanent house was a foolish investment, a trap that would anchor him to the suffering of the world. So he designed and built a masterpiece of medieval minimalist architecture. He constructed a tiny, portable shelter known as a Hōjō, which translates to a 10-foot square hut. The dimensions were incredibly strict, 10 feet by 10 feet and 7 feet high. To ensure he would never feel geographically trapped, he built the hut without a permanent foundation. He designed the walls with flat-pack-style metal joints, allowing him to easily dismantle the entire structure, load it onto a pair of wooden carts, and rebuild it wherever he chose. He stripped his possessions down to absolute necessities. Inside his tiny room, he kept a simple bed made of gathered fern fronds, a small shelf holding a few volumes of poetry and religious texts, and his beloved musical instruments, a folding koto and a biwa. For a time, Chōmei lived a life that modern escapists dream about. He disconnected entirely from the chaotic news cycle of Kyoto. His daily routine was dictated only by the rising and setting of the sun. He spent his mornings walking through the dense green mountain trails, picking wild wisteria and gathering berries. In the evenings, he sat on the small wooden porch of his hut, strumming his lute, watching the moonlight filter through the ancient pine trees, and writing poetry. When he looked out from his mountain peak, he could see the distant lights of the capital city. As he looked down at Kyoto, a very specific physical sensation blossomed in his chest. His posture straightened. He felt a deep, warm glow of intense satisfaction. He pictured the wealthy aristocrats down in the valley, frantically scheming for promotions, hoarding their wealth and living in constant terror of the next earthquake. Chōmei pitied them. He felt a profound sense of spiritual superiority over the stressed-out city dwellers. He believed he had finally won the game. He believed that by owning almost nothing and living in absolute simplicity, he had achieved perfect, unassailable enlightenment. But the silence of the remote mountains is a mirror, and eventually it forces you to look at your own reflection without any distractions. One quiet morning, sitting alone in the stillness of his perfectly minimal life, the tension of the narrative breaks. A horrifying, uncomfortable realization crashes down upon Chōmei, shattering his illusion of perfect peace. He looks around his tiny 10-foot room. He looks at his fern bed, his shelf, and the walls of the hut he designed with his own hands. He realizes that he loves this hut. He loves the absolute silence. He loves the image of himself as the wise, detached hermit living a pure life. He realizes that his glowing sense of superiority over the city dwellers is undeniable proof that his ego is not dead at all. His ego is alive, thriving, and aggressively running the show. Chōmei documents this devastating psychological epiphany in the final pages of his survival manual, the Hōjōki. Confronting his own hypocrisy, he writes a line that cuts through centuries of human self-deception. "It is a sin for me now to love my little hut, and my attachment to its solitude may also be a hindrance to salvation." Read that quote, and let the immense weight of his realization settle into your mind. Chōmei discovers that he did not actually eliminate his attachments, he merely downsized them. He traded a material obsession for a sprawling, wealthy mansion for a material obsession with a tiny wooden box. He recognizes that extreme asceticism can be just as greedy, just as identity-driven, and just as toxic as extreme materialism. His deep pride in his simple life and his intense love for his tiny hut was just another form of attachment tying him down. The ego did not die when he threw away his wealth. It just changed its clothes and moved into the woods. He realized that holding on to the identity of the perfect minimalist was a heavy, exhausting burden. If his peace of mind required absolute silence, 0 neighbors, and a perfectly empty 10-foot square room, then his peace of mind was incredibly fragile. He was still a prisoner, just a prisoner in a much smaller cell. This realization brings us to the single, vital payoff of this module, the one actionable truth you must internalize to break free from the minimalist trap. True freedom is the practice of mental non-attachment, not the mathematical calculation of owning fewer physical things. You cannot buy your way to peace of mind, and equally, you cannot throw away your way to peace of mind. You must stop trying to make a rigid, ego-driven identity out of your simplicity. Think about how this applies to your daily life right now. When you feel the intense, burning compulsion to aggressively clean your room, throw out your clothes, or isolate yourself from a messy situation, you must pause and examine the physical tension in your body. Notice the clenched jaw and the restricted breathing. Recognize that you are trying to use your external environment to force an internal emotion. Instead of frantically bagging up your belongings to chase a temporary dopamine hit, practice the art of internal flexibility. The goal is not to live in an empty, sterile white room where nothing ever goes wrong. The goal is to develop the mental capacity to stand in the middle of a messy living room, look at a cluttered desk, or face a chaotic week, and maintain a slow, steady heart rate. True resilience means your internal baseline of calm remains intact, regardless of the visual friction surrounding you. You can own a massive estate and remain completely unattached to it, ready to let it go the moment the earth shakes. Conversely, you can own a single wooden bowl and be a raging, miserable prisoner to it if you allow that bowl to define your identity. Do not let your environment, whether cluttered or perfectly bare, become the master of your emotional state. So if you cannot find true lasting peace in the chaotic, wealthy city, and you cannot find true peace by cutting off the world and isolating yourself in a perfectly minimal hut in the woods, where exactly is happiness supposed to live? The answer requires a radical, deeply uncomfortable mental shift regarding the nature of human connection and the heaviest burden you carry every single day. Chapter 4. The Danger of Self-Righteous Isolation. You wait all week for the perfect Sunday morning. You plan everything with meticulous precision. You silence your phone, draw the blackout curtains, brew a premium cup of coffee, and sit down in your perfectly organized living room. You expect that by completely shutting out the noise of the outside world, a wave of profound tranquility will wash over you. You expect your muscles to uncoil and your mind to finally experience absolute stillness. But reality delivers a harsh, immediate contradiction. 5 minutes into your perfect silence, a neighbor next door starts a lawnmower, or your phone screen lights up with a single trivial text message from a co-worker. Notice what happens to your physical body in that exact fraction of a second. Your chest tightens. A sudden spike of heat flushes the back of your neck. Your jaw clamps shut, and your breathing instantly shifts from deep exhales to shallow, rapid gasps. A surge of irrational, blinding frustration floods your nervous system. You expected peace, but what you actually built was an environment of extreme fragility. You have convinced yourself that other people are the primary obstacle to your happiness, completely unaware that requiring absolute silence to feel calm means you are not peaceful at all. You are just a hostage to your environment. We live in a culture that actively romanticizes withdrawal. When you experience conflict at work, friction in a relationship, or the overwhelming pressure of societal expectations, the modern reflex is to cut the cord. We are bombarded with advice telling us to ruthlessly cut toxic people out of our lives, to set impenetrable boundaries, and to protect our energy by isolating ourselves from anything that causes us discomfort. The relatable problem we all face is a profound lack of emotional endurance. We look at the messy, unpredictable, and often frustrating nature of human interaction and decide that the cost of connection is simply too high. We convince ourselves that if we just retreat into our own customized, heavily controlled bubbles, where nobody challenges us, nobody interrupts us, and nobody demands anything of our time, we will finally discover true contentment. We treat isolation as the ultimate life hack, a shortcut to spiritual enlightenment and emotional safety. We believe that by removing the friction of other human beings, we remove the source of our suffering. Yet the tension in this narrative snaps when we examine the cold biological reality of what prolonged isolation actually does to the human brain, and when we look back at those who tried this exact experiment centuries before us. Over 800 years ago, in the dense, silent mountains of 12th century Japan, Kamo no Chōmei achieved the exact lifestyle that modern escapists crave. After witnessing the collapse of his society in Kyoto, Chōmei abandoned human connection entirely. He built his tiny 10-foot square hut deep in the wilderness, miles away from the aristocratic drama, the relentless noise of the capital, and the unpredictable demands of his peers. He designed a life of absolute physical and social isolation. For a time, he reveled in his solitude. He wrote poetry, played his lute, and watched the seasons change without a single human interruption. But Chōmei possessed a rare level of self-awareness, and he began to document a disturbing psychological shift within himself. He noticed that the longer he stayed away from society, the more rigid and intolerant his mind became. In his writings, he describes occasional interactions with the young son of a mountain guard, who would sometimes accompany him on walks. Chōmei realized that while he enjoyed the boy's company, he was also harboring a deep, secret arrogance. He viewed himself as a spiritually superior hermit who had conquered the trivial desires of the world, while looking down upon those who still lived in society. By retreating from the world to avoid suffering, he had accidentally nurtured a massive, fragile ego. His peace was entirely dependent on conditions he could not control permanently. He realized that a serenity that shatters the moment another human being walks into the room is not true serenity at all. It is just a highly manicured form of hiding. Modern psychology has a specific clinical term for the defense mechanism Chōmei experienced, and it completely dismantles the modern advice to isolate yourself from difficulty. Psychologists call it hyper-independence. We tend to view the ability to walk away from people and function entirely alone as a sign of profound strength and self-reliance. However, current clinical research reveals a much darker truth. Hyper-independence rarely begins as a genuine expression of personal autonomy. It begins as a trauma response. When a person experiences repeated relational friction, betrayal, or an environment that feels emotionally unsafe, the brain adapts by rewriting its survival code. The nervous system learns a devastating lesson. If you want to be safe, you must never rely on another human being again. A compelling 2025 study published in the International Journal of Interdisciplinary Approaches in Psychology investigated this exact phenomenon among young adults. The researchers meticulously examined the correlation between hyper-independence, attachment styles, and internal emotional states. The data revealed that individuals who exhibit extreme self-reliance and constantly isolate themselves from social friction do not experience higher levels of happiness or peace. Instead, Hyper-independence is heavily correlated with avoidant attachment and severe internalized shame. The researchers labeled this state emotional exile. The people who boast about cutting everyone off and needing absolutely no one are frequently operating from a place of deep-seated fear. They are so terrified of the vulnerability and unpredictability required to maintain human connection that they preemptively reject society to avoid the possibility of being rejected themselves. What presents itself on the outside as stoic self-sufficiency is in reality a defensive posture shielding a fragile, highly reactive nervous system. The physical manifestations of this emotional exile are impossible to ignore if you know what to look for. Watch the posture of someone who has engineered a life devoid of social friction. When they are forced to wait in a crowded line, sit in traffic, or navigate a disagreement with a stranger, their body instantly betrays their supposed inner peace. Their shoulders pull up toward their ears. They cross their arms tightly over their chest, creating a physical barrier. Their gaze darts around the room, hyper-vigilant and scanning for threats. They cannot tolerate the normal, chaotic noise of public existence because they have spent years conditioning their brain to view any external interruption as a direct assault on their safety. By avoiding the minor discomforts of human interaction, they have effectively destroyed their emotional immune system. Just as a body kept in a completely sterile room becomes violently ill the moment it encounters a common cold, a mind kept in perfect, uninterrupted silence becomes overwhelmed by the slightest social inconvenience. The consequences of this self-righteous isolation extend far beyond a low tolerance for annoyance. The data shows it is a literal death sentence for the physical body. We often assume that stress is caused by having too many obligations and too many people demanding our attention. But the human animal is biologically hardwired for a tribe. When you sever those connections and enforce chronic isolation, the body registers the absolute silence not as relaxation, but as a severe, life-threatening emergency. In a landmark advisory, the United States Surgeon General detailed the catastrophic medical realities of our modern epidemic of loneliness and social isolation. The statistics are terrifying and completely shatter the illusion that running away from society improves your health. The clinical data demonstrates that lacking adequate social connection increases the risk of premature death by more than 60%. To put that physical toll into perspective, the physical deterioration caused by chronic social isolation is mathematically equivalent to smoking up to 15 cigarettes every single day. Furthermore, the lack of human friction and engagement accelerates cognitive and cardiovascular decline, increasing the risk of stroke by 32% and increasing the risk of developing dementia by a staggering 50%. When you sit in your perfectly quiet room, refusing to engage with the world because it feels too messy, your brain is quietly flooding your bloodstream with cortisol. In the absence of a social group, the primal regions of your brain assume you have been abandoned by the tribe, leaving you completely vulnerable to predators. Your nervous system stays locked in a low-grade fight-or-flight state 24 hours a day. The very isolation you built to protect yourself from stress becomes the exact mechanism that physically destroys your heart and your mind. Chōmei felt this subtle deterioration creeping into his life on the mountain. He realized that by completely removing himself from the irritations of the aristocratic court, he had also removed the mirror that showed him his own flaws. A hermit has no one to argue with, no one to compromise with, and no one to forgive. Without the constant grating friction of other people, it is incredibly easy to convince yourself that you are perfectly enlightened and morally superior. But it is a counterfeit enlightenment. If your philosophy, your patience, and your kindness can only exist in a vacuum, then they do not actually exist at all. Chōmei recognized that isolating yourself to avoid suffering is a deeply flawed escape. The world is inherently chaotic, noisy, and full of difficult people. Attempting to force the world to be quiet so you can be comfortable is a war you will permanently lose. This brings us to the single, critical payoff of this module, the fundamental shift you must make to survive the modern world. You must stop trying to build a physical fortress away from society and instead cultivate an inner hut. You must build a mental sanctuary of adaptability. True resilience is not the ability to retreat from the world and hide in silence. It is the capacity to stand in the absolute center of a chaotic, loud and demanding environment while keeping your internal heart rate steady. The goal is not to eradicate the friction of other people, but to increase your emotional bandwidth so that the friction no longer leaves you exhausted. Think about how this applies to your physical reactions. Right now, when a coworker interrupts you or a stranger cuts you off in traffic, your biological response is to tense your muscles and hold your breath. You fight the reality of the interruption. To build your inner hut, you must practice the art of strategic non-resistance. The next time your perfect Sunday morning is shattered by a loud noise or an unexpected demand, do not try to block it out. Do not aggressively put in noise-canceling headphones or lash out in anger. Instead, sit entirely still. Deliberately drop your shoulders away from your ears. Unclench your jaw. Take a slow breath that expands your ribs outward and actively invite the noise into your space. Mentally label the intrusion not as a threat to your peace, but as a practice weight for your emotional endurance. Acknowledge that the world is loud and the people in it are messy, unpredictable, and flawed, including yourself. By accepting the noise rather than fighting it, you instantly neutralize its power over your nervous system. You learn to carry your silence inside your own chest, allowing you to walk through the most chaotic environments on Earth without ever losing your center. You no longer need a physical cabin in the woods to feel safe, because your safety is no longer dependent on the behavior of the people around you. You develop the profound ability to engage with society, to experience the full spectrum of human connection, and to face the inevitable conflicts of life without needing to run away. You step out of emotional exile and rejoin the human race, not as a fragile victim of circumstance, but as an unshakable participant. But building this unbreakable inner sanctuary, this mental architecture that can withstand any external storm, is not just about passively accepting the chaos around you. It is not about simply tolerating the noise. To truly master the philosophy of the inner hut and achieve a permanent state of psychological freedom, it requires a specific, active unburdening. You must confront and release the heaviest, most exhausting thing you carry with you every single day. Chapter 5. The Ultimate Unburdening. You stare at your reflection in the mirror at the end of a long, exhausting day, mentally cataloging every single mistake you made since you woke up. You replay conversations in your head, analyzing the exact tone of your voice, dissecting the minor awkward pauses, and punishing yourself for not appearing smarter, calmer, or more put together. You expect that by relentlessly analyzing your flaws and aggressively pursuing a flawless version of yourself, you will eventually unlock a state of permanent, unshakable happiness. You believe that if you read enough books, optimize your daily routine, and meticulously scrub away all your human imperfections, the heavy, suffocating weight of anxiety will finally vanish. But reality delivers a brutal, counterintuitive truth. The harder you try to perfect your identity, the heavier the burden becomes. The pursuit of the perfect self does not lead to freedom. It leads to a state of permanent, agonizing exhaustion. Today, we confront the final and most deceptive trap of human psychology by examining the breathtaking final realization of a 12th century hermit who tried and failed to achieve perfect spiritual enlightenment. You will discover why the obsession with self-improvement is actively destroying your peace of mind, and what radical shift you must make to finally put the heavy backpack of your identity down. To understand the crushing weight of the modern ego, we must first look at the physical reality of how you carry your identity every single day. We treat the concept of the self as a collection of rigid, unquestionable rules. You build an image in your mind of who you are supposed to be. Perhaps you identify as the hardest worker in your office, the incredibly patient parent, the intellectual who never loses an argument, or the minimalist who needs absolutely nothing. Once you construct this identity, your brain treats it as a physical structure that must be defended at all costs. Notice the physical manifestations in your body when someone challenges this identity. If a coworker questions your competence or a family member criticizes your patience, your biological reaction is instantaneous and violent. Your chest tightens. A sharp spike of heat flushes across your collarbones and up the back of your neck. Your jaw clamps shut, grinding your teeth together, and your heart rate accelerates to a frantic, pounding rhythm. In that fraction of a second, your nervous system does not differentiate between a physical threat to your life and a verbal threat to your ego. Your brain floods your bloodstream with adrenaline and cortisol, preparing you to fight a war simply because someone pointed out a crack in the armor of your perfect identity. We spend our entire lives dragging this heavy, armored backpack of the self everywhere we go. We walk into rooms and instantly scan the environment, calculating how we are being perceived, adjusting our posture, and modulating our voices to ensure nobody sees our underlying insecurities. The sheer amount of caloric and emotional energy required to maintain this facade is staggering. We are a society collapsing under the weight of our own curated identities, desperately trying to maintain the illusion that we have everything under control. This desperation has birthed a modern psychological epidemic. We take the exhausting burden of our flawed identities and attempt to cure it through the relentless pursuit of perfection. We convince ourselves that if we just optimize our diets, our sleep schedules, our productivity, and our emotional regulation, we will finally become bulletproof. However, clinical data reveals that this obsession with achieving a flawless existence is not a cure. It is the exact mechanism causing our collective mental collapse. Researchers in the field of psychology have spent years dissecting this phenomenon, and the findings shatter the cultural myth that striving for perfection leads to happiness. Dr. Thomas Curran, a prominent social psychologist and researcher at the London School of Economics, has conducted extensive global studies on the rising rates of perfectionism, particularly among modern generations. Through analyzing decades of data involving tens of thousands of individuals, Curran and his colleagues identified a terrifying surge in what they classify as multi-dimensional perfectionism. This is not the healthy desire to do a good job or the natural human inclination to improve. Multi-dimensional perfectionism is a toxic, paralyzing framework driven entirely by the fear of failure, the terror of criticism, and the agonizing belief that you are fundamentally inadequate just as you are. Curran's research highlights a specific, devastating variant called socially prescribed perfectionism. This is the internal, crushing belief that society, your peers, and your family demand absolute flawlessness from you, and that any deviation from that impossible standard will result in immediate rejection. When you operate under this psychological framework, your daily life ceases to be a journey of growth and transforms into a high-stakes performance where you are perpetually terrified of dropping the ball. The clinical data links this specific type of perfectionism directly to massive spikes in chronic anxiety, severe depression, and profound professional burnout. The relentless pressure to curate a flawless life, amplified by digital platforms that constantly broadcast the impossible achievements of others, creates an environment where you feel you are constantly failing, no matter how hard you work. But the devastation of this perfectionist trap extends far beyond emotional exhaustion. It leaves a brutal, measurable trail of destruction on your physical cardiovascular system. When we look at psychophysiological research regarding how the body handles the pressure of trying to be perfect, the raw biology is alarming. Scientists have measured the physical responses of perfectionists facing routine challenges and inevitable failures. The data shows that individuals harboring maladaptive perfectionism experience severe, prolonged physiological stress reactions. When a perfectionist makes a minor mistake, their body does not just register a brief moment of disappointment. It triggers a catastrophic biological alarm. Cardiovascular studies measuring heart rate variability, HRV, a crucial metric indicating how well your nervous system recovers from stress, demonstrate that perfectionists have a significantly diminished capacity to bounce back from failure. When you demand perfection from yourself, your body remains locked in a rigid state of sympathetic nervous system arousal. Your heart rate stays elevated. Your blood vessels remain constricted. Your body constantly pumps cortisol and inflammatory markers into your bloodstream because it believes your minor social or professional slip-up is an existential threat. Over years and decades, this chronic low-grade inflammation and cardiovascular rigidity drastically increases the risk of hypertension, heart disease, and premature physical deterioration. You are quite literally breaking your own heart in your desperate, unending quest to prove to the world that you are flawless. The tragic irony of self-improvement is that the more aggressively you try to fix yourself, the more broken you feel. We assume that achieving the ultimate state of detachment, the ultimate state of productivity, or the ultimate state of spiritual enlightenment will finally grant us peace. But the desire to be perfectly enlightened is just another ego-driven desire. The desire to own nothing and be a perfect minimalist is just another heavy identity to carry. To witness the profound historical manifestation of this exact paradox, we must return to the remote, silent forests of Mount Hino in 12th century Japan and examine the final, breathtaking revelation of Kamo no Chōmei. As we established, Chōmei fled the burning, chaotic, status-obsessed capital of Kyoto. He rejected the massive estates, the political games, and the endless accumulation of wealth. He walked into the mountains, built a tiny, portable 10-foot square hut, and stripped his life down to the absolute bare essentials. He adopted the identity of the pure, detached Buddhist hermit. For years, he lived a life of rigorous simplicity. He gathered his own food, played his lute under the moon and studied sacred texts, striving to eliminate every single worldly attachment from his heart. He believed he was walking the exact perfect path to enlightenment. He believed he had successfully shed the heavy armor of his ego and achieved a state of absolute, unassailable spiritual purity. But as Chōmei approached the end of his life, a profound and uncomfortable realization crept into his mind. He sat on the small wooden porch of his hut, surrounded by the towering, ancient pines, listening to the gentle rustle of the wind. He looked at the simple fern bed he had made. He looked at his beloved musical instruments. He felt a deep, overwhelming wave of affection for his quiet, solitary life. And in that exact moment of quiet observation, the illusion of his perfect enlightenment shattered. Chōmei realized that he had spent his entire time in the mountains playing a role. He had traded the identity of a wealthy court poet for the identity of a wise, superior hermit. He recognized that his intense, burning desire to achieve perfect Buddhist detachment had become a massive, suffocating attachment in itself. He was grading himself on his spiritual performance. He was demanding perfection from his own mind. If he felt a pang of loneliness, he condemned himself for not being detached enough. If he felt a surge of pride looking down at the chaotic city of Kyoto, he punished himself for still harboring an ego. He was carrying the exact same heavy armored backpack of the self that he carried in the city. He had just painted it a different color. In the stunning, vulnerable conclusion of his survival manual, the Hōjōki, Chōmei documents this psychological collapse. He interrogates his own soul with unflinching honesty. He writes about the core teachings of his faith, which demand the abandonment of all earthly ties, and then he looks at his own heart and realizes he cannot do it. He loves his hut. He loves his peaceful mornings. He still harbors traces of arrogance and traces of sorrow. He is a walking, breathing contradiction. He asks himself a final, devastating question. He asks his own mind, "You fled the world to live in the forests and mountains, to quiet your mind and walk the true path. Yet, while your appearance is that of a holy man, your heart remains steeped in impurity. Are you a hypocrite? Have your past sins caught up with you? Or has your fragile mind simply driven you mad?" Notice the intense internal tension in those words. This is the voice of a man who has dedicated his entire existence to achieving a state of flawless, spiritual perfection, only to realize that he has entirely failed. He is staring into the abyss of his own human imperfection. According to the strict rules he set for himself, he should be consumed by shame. He should tear down his hut, punish himself for his arrogance, and try even harder to eradicate his ego. He should tighten his jaw, clench his fists, and go back to war against his own nature. But Chōmei does something revolutionary. He does the one thing that modern perfectionists find absolutely terrifying. He simply stops trying. The tension resolves not with a dramatic breakthrough of sudden, magical enlightenment, but with a quiet, profound surrender. Chōmei realizes that the ultimate burden he is carrying is not his wealth, his status, or his possessions. The ultimate burden is his demand for his own perfection. In the final lines of the text, his tongue freezes. He stops analyzing his flaws. He stops interrogating his own purity. He accepts that he is a flawed, contradictory, imperfect human being who cannot completely rid himself of attachments. Instead of chanting long, complex prayers to force his mind into submission, he simply recites a brief, humble invocation, acknowledging his own limitations, and lets the silence take over. He drops the heavy backpack. He accepts his failure to be perfect, and in that exact moment of radical acceptance, he achieves the authentic peace he had been chasing his entire life. This brings us to the ultimate payoff of this module, and the most critical psychological shift you must make to survive the crushing pressure of the modern world. You must let go of your need to have it all figured out. You must abandon the exhausting, toxic pursuit of the perfect self. Authentic, durable peace of mind does not come from optimizing every second of your day, eradicating all your bad habits, or achieving a state of robotic, emotionless detachment. True peace is found in the radical acceptance of your own human contradictions. Think about how this applies to the physical tension you carry right now. When you make a mistake at work, when you lose your temper with a loved one, or when you catch yourself acting out of ego or jealousy, your instinct is to tense up. Your instinct is to flood your body with cortisol, berate yourself for failing, and immediately construct a new, rigid plan to ensure you never make that mistake again. You declare war on your own humanity. To practice the ultimate unburdening, you must consciously intercept this biological reaction. The next time you stumble, the next time you fail to meet the impossible standards you set for yourself, stop moving. Notice the heat in your neck and the tightness in your chest. Instead of fighting the sensation, deliberately drop your shoulders. Unclench your hands. Take a deep, slow breath that expands your ribcage, and actively surrender to the reality of your imperfection. Tell yourself the exact truth. You are a flawed human being navigating a chaotic universe, and that is entirely acceptable. You do not need to defend your ego when someone criticizes you. You can simply nod and allow them to hold their opinion without your heart rate changing a single beat. You do not need to be the smartest person in the room, the most productive worker in the office, or the most enlightened minimalist on the mountain. By giving yourself permission to be ordinary, to be contradictory, and to be a work in progress, you instantly neutralize the paralyzing fear of failure that drives your anxiety. You take the heavy iron armor of your identity, unbuckle the straps, and let it crash to the floor. You step out of the prison of perfectionism and walk into the open air. You realize that you never needed a flawless environment, a massive bank account, or a perfectly isolated hut in the woods to feel safe. Your safety was always available, hiding quietly beneath your relentless demands for perfection, waiting for the exact moment you finally decided to stop fighting yourself. You can't outrun your mind, no matter how deep into the woods you retreat. True freedom begins when you stop changing your geography and start mastering your internal reactions. To build that unshakable mental fortress right now, click on screen to watch How to Control Your Mind and Mood, Stoicism audiobook.